Freezer door cocktails. Have you heard of these before? The inspiration for today's episode comes from a coworker who wanted to learn about freezer door cocktails specifically for entertaining or having a get together at your house. I think this is a great idea. They work really well for a poker game or maybe even a board game like Monopoly or Clue. Clue feels especially apt. I think a martini or Manhattan with Colonel Mustard in the library could be a good time. A good candidate for a freezer door drink is going to be a stirred drink, and one that is usually pretty spirit forward. A lot of stirred drinks are, but a martini or a Manhattan are the two kind of riffs or variations I'm going to show off today. And they work really well because both of them have a relatively high alcohol by volume. In order to not freeze your freezer door cocktail, you're going to need something that is usually in excess of about 30% ABV as a total mix. I can share a calculator if there's interest in how you can go and figure that out, but there's a few online that I'm sure you can find too. The Manhattan riff I'm going to make is a drink I made up called a Peace Bridge. It's kind of a mix between two different cocktails, a mix between a Manhattan and a Toronto. It will use whiskey, and I'm going to use Punt as my sweet vermouth, and also Fernet Branca. And the reason I called it that is because if you're looking on Google Maps in between the cities of Manhattan and Toronto, you have to drive a long way. And the bridge that you cross from the US to Canada border is called the Peace Bridge. Also, I feel like Fernet Branca is one of those that may need a little bit of a subtle introduction. So this is one that doesn't use a whole lot of Fernet. You could certainly dial it up a bit if you wanted to, but I think it's a nice introduction to a relatively bitter Italian Amaro. Also, we'll be doing a martini, which is pretty similar to a Bobby Huegel recipe. Bobby Huegel started the Anvil Bar amongst several other bars in the Houston area, and it's an excellent build. He calls for a gin that I didn't have, so I subbed it. Still an excellent drink and a really good recipe, so props to Bobby. And then in addition to those ingredients, we'll also be adding water. You need water instead of ice for a freezer door cocktail, because normally when you're stirring a drink with ice, you're both chilling and diluting, whereas this time we'll be diluting first and then chilling second in the freezer. So today I'm going to build all these drinks, and I won't actually taste them in this episode, but today I'll talk through how I constructed these three recipes, and then I'll physically build them, and we'll put them in the freezer to taste at a later date. All right, so let's get building some cocktails. I'm going to do both of them in this big glass jug here using my trusty scale, and then I'll transfer them to another container to put them in the freezer for later. So I mentioned ABV a little bit. Something that is super important is knowing what the strength is of your drink as compared to the temperature of your freezer. And so usually a lot of freezers are set to be right around 0 Fahrenheit. But unfortunately, a lot of them are colder than that. So if you have a digital readout and you can tell how cold your freezer is, go ahead and play with that thermostat and maybe even bring it up a few degrees just to 0. A lot of times, before I did these, I found that my freezer was at -4, and I think it goes as low as -8. But yeah, adjust it to about 0. Maybe depending on how strong your martini is, if you're doing a really, really, really dry martini, you can probably get away with -2, -3, something like that. But I have my freezer set at 0 for right now. And the ABV of this entire mixture is just over 30, maybe 31%. You can do that based on a weighted average of all the ingredients in the blend. Just make sure you don't forget the water, because the water is going to contribute 0% ABV, even though it will contribute volume. So it'll bring down that average. I can explain more if that's interesting, but I think you can do it. So we'll start with, this is a Tanqueray London Dry Gin. I'm going to do 11 ounces here. And for a little movie magic, I've actually pre-apportioned the Tanqueray because I'm going to be using this bottle to pour the whole mix back in. I also just noticed that 5 of the 6 bottles I have here are green. Kind of strange. We will use a little bit more gin. So this cocktail, I mentioned this is kind of very similar to a Bobby Huegel recipe. He calls for London Dry, Tanqueray London Dry, and then also what they call Tanqueray 10. And Tanq Ten is really citrusy. I think they use some grapefruit and a little bit more citrus blend than what the London Dry uses. I didn't have Tanq Ten on hand, even though it's a great gin. I have this Nolet's dry gin, which is very kind of like rose and peachy. So even though it isn't nearly as citrusy, it is a counterpoint that isn't quite as juniper forward as the London Dry, and I think will work great in this cocktail. And so for the Nolet's gin, I'm going to need 4 ounces here. And then here we have a different dry vermouth than I've used in the past. The first video I ever shot, I did a martini video also, and it was using Nolet dry vermouth. This is from a different producer called Noilly Prat, and they call this one extra dry. This one is maybe a little bit more like appley. Yeah, it smells, I get more oxidative character than just kind of like spiced white wine character. I think it's really great for a martini, and it also works really great with this Nolet dry gin that has those peach notes I was talking about. And so for the extra dry vermouth, we'll also need 4 ounces. And that is pretty much it from the normal bottle perspective. What we'll also be adding though, that is, it's hard to say it's the most important part, but it's a super important part of a freezer door cocktail, is the water. And so for this drink, we're gonna need 6.5 ounces of water. That maybe sounds like a lot, but this batch that I'm making is for roughly 6.5 drink equivalents. So it's only an ounce of water per drink. And that would be pretty normal for what you'd achieve if you were stirring a martini well. Then I'm going to transfer everything back into this empty London Dry bottle, and we'll pop it in the freezer. You don't really need to stir it because it's just going to be remixed as you pour it into this other bottle, but you could if you wanted to. This was not at all something I thought I'd include in the video, but I just tried a sip of the pre-frozen freezer door martini, and it's really interesting. I guess there's a few cocktails that are served without ice. I think they have their history in an area where it was hard to get ice, or even just they're older than having ice. The original old fashioned actually wasn't made with ice. There's a tropical drink known as a tea punch, T-I punch, that was historically also served without ice. And so it's a really fun experience. And like I said, that Nolet dry gin, to me, actually on its own in a martini is like too peachy, too rosy. But having the mix as mostly London Dry, which I do really like, cut with a little bit of that kind of peachy quality along with the dry vermouth, it's going to be great when it's frozen. Anyway, moving on, let's get into the Peace Bridge. So for this one, I'm doing Texas 1 single malt. I need 12 ounces of this. Here's one also that I've pre-measured. I've got 12 ounces in here so that I can pour everything back in here for the freezer. There we go. And so like I said before, this is a riff on a Manhattan. And so a Manhattan often is 2 parts whiskey to 1 part sweet vermouth. I'm blending this a little bit differently. So this sweet vermouth is actually going to be a little bit more bitter leaning than say a Cocchi di Torino, or I've used Carpano Antica before. Normally, if I am using a Cocchi di Torino or something else that's a little bit more normal, I would not use quite as much of it. I'd actually use equal parts sweet vermouth and Fernet Branca, but I've skewed the blend a little bit more towards the sweet vermouth just because it's already providing more bitterness. And so using the full amount of Fernet Branca would have just been a little bit too bracing, I think. And so onto the sweet vermouth, the Punt, I'm going to be doing 5 ounces here. And then for the Fernet Branca, I need 3 ounces. And then finally, we'll use 6.5 ounces of water. All right, perfect. Now we'll transfer it back into our single malt bottle here. So first up, we've got the Peace Bridge. This is, as a note, has been sitting in the fridge for about 36 hours, which I'm noticing may be a little bit too long, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Something that's really interesting about sensory with the drink this cold, you can actually see the frost on the glass, is that the receptors to sweetness and the roundness of the drink are a little bit deadened because the drink is so cold, but the bitterness is still there. And so in tasting this, it's almost too bitter up front, especially if you're not used to Fernet. But as it warms up, even just a little bit, it doesn't have to be warm, but out of the freezer temp, it'll be a little bit more approachable and a little bit more balanced. I also, as you can see here, garnished with a cherry instead of with citrus. The Fernet in this drink is fairly sharp, and so adding the cherry actually rounds it and softens it instead of the citrus, like if you used a grapefruit or a lemon, would punch through and make it even more intense. So with the garnishing, I was looking for that specific sweetness effect. I'll grab the martini now, one sec. And now for the martini, I'm actually doing something similar with the garnish in that the citrusy qualities of the gin aren't really super present here. It's more of a floral herbal punch. And so I think pairing olives rather than citrus with a less citrusy gin works really well. And so I did 3. You should do usually an odd number of olives or cherries or something for a garnish. So I went with 3. And so this one, if you're looking at the ABV mix of the 2 drinks, is actually the lower in ABV of the 2. And so I mentioned maybe if you're making one of these drinks, probably don't let it go in the freezer for more than 24 hours. Maybe make it early in the morning for that night, or make it the night before for an event the next evening. But I think letting them go 36 hours, this one was actually a little bit slushy in the bottle. So something to be aware of there. It's a great recipe that's super easy to serve with your friends just because it's done. I didn't do anything to it but garnish it. And I did put these coupe glasses in the freezer, so they were frozen overnight. And then you can just pour the drink straight in the glass. And like I said, even though the inspiration for this episode did come from a friend, from a coworker, I think that this also comes from personal experience because I recently hosted a poker night for my birthday. And when we all got together, it's a lot of fun to make a lot of drinks for a lot of people. But if somebody is constantly up, shaking or stirring or doing something like that, it does take away from the flow of the evening. And so batching your cocktails like this, putting them in the freezer, still lets you have a really high quality experience, but doesn't mean that somebody has to be behind that bar preparing those drinks constantly. You can focus more on the friendship, focus more on whatever the activity is, and then the drinks are already taken care of and they're going to be really high quality, but you don't have to put as much time into them that evening. That's all for these freezer door cocktails today. I hope you can use one or maybe even both of these recipes to have at your next game night or family get together. At the end of the day, drinks are for fun. And my goal with this channel is to teach people enough so they can share that fun with the people they love. Come and be amazed at what you can do. Cheers.